Okay, welcome. In chapter 7, Jesus is going to rumble, and he's going to rumble with the Pharisees about their outward religion. And it begins when the Pharisees complain to Jesus about the fact that his disciples are eating with impure hands, which Mark goes to say means unwashed hands. Now, don't think this is like when you scrub your hands with soap and water to get the dirt off, and your mom is so proud of you. No, this is a ceremonial washing. They'd cup their hands, and water would be poured over them to make them ceremoniously clean in order to eat. The only problem is God never asked them to do this. In Exodus chapter 30, the priests were to ceremoniously wash their hands and feet before entering the temple because they were unclean. However, the Pharisees went ahead and extended this to all the Jews for any variety of activities. Now, Jesus refers to this twice in this chapter as a tradition of the elders. Now, what is a tradition? It is the expansion that the Pharisees made on the laws of God that were never authorized by God. This is known as fencing, where you build a fence around God's law to make sure that the people can never get near it. So God says that the Sabbath day is not a work day. It's a day to devote to me. So the Pharisees say, therefore, you can't cook. You can't light a fire. You can only take so many steps. And so this was the heart of the Pharisees' legalistic interpretation of the law. Now, Jesus turns the table on them in verse 6 and 7 by quoting Isaiah. And he said to them, "Rightly did Isaiah prophesy of you hypocrites, as it is written, this people honors me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. But in vain do they worship me." Here it comes. "Teaching as doctrines the precepts of men." Jesus said that the issue here is inward versus outward religion. He said, you Pharisees have an outward religion, but it lacks any inward reality. And so the result we read in this verse is that their worship is empty, it's not acceptable to God, it's vain, and their teaching is not from God, it's from man's wisdom, it's man-pleasing. And then in verse, I guess it's 11, he cites another example of their hypocritical teaching, and that is the idea of Corban. Now, Corban literally means devoted to or reserved for God. Now, when somebody made their property devoted to God, they could continue to use it. It's just at some point, often upon their death, it had to be turned over to the temple. So, for instance, if I had a beautiful house and my parents were in dire need, I could say my house is devoted to God, it's Corban. Therefore, I wouldn't have to sell it to help my parents out. And then when I died, it went to the temple. So I could do this either out of greed or just malice towards my parents. And so it made void the word of God. Now, in verse 15, Jesus is going to lay out a dynamite principle, especially for today. And let's read it. Verse 15, he says, "There is nothing outside the man which can defile him if it goes into him, but the things which proceed out of the man are what defile him." So it's not eating with unwashed hands. It's not eating certain foods, but that which defiles the man is what comes out of him. In other words, it's nothing in our environment that is the cause for our defilement or our sinful activity. This flies in the face of today's victimhood culture, where people are considered good and that they only do bad because of the environment. Their parents, their society, the prejudice of others, temptations around them. And Jesus says, no, the problem is the heart. You need to focus on your own responsibility. Mark points out in verse 19 that this teaching that Jesus gives about defilement coming from within means that all foods are now clean. And so right there, he does away with the food laws of the Old Testament. But look at this. We jump down just a couple of verses in verse 20, and we read this. "And Jesus was saying, that which proceeds out of the man, that is what defiles a man. For from within, out of the heart of men, proceed the evil thoughts, fornications, thefts, murders, and adulteries. So Jesus said, it's not what comes into a man, so therefore the food laws, for instance, are done away with. But he says what defiles a man are his immoral actions. And he has a whole list there, and it continues beyond what I read. So what that says is that while the Old Testament food laws have passed away, the moral laws of the Old Testament are fully enforced because these are the things that defile us. Now, it's not a question, as some people want to make it, of either having to take all the laws of the Old Testament, some of which they ridicule, or have none of the laws of the Old Testament. We just have to let the New Testament tell us which laws are for us today. And here's one place Jesus does it. And throughout the New Testament, if anyone cares to look, we find out that the categories of laws that do not affect us and those which do. The Ten Commandments, for instance, are fully enforced. Now, our chapter ends with Jesus casting out a demon and then him healing a man who can neither hear nor speak. And I want to focus for a minute on the demon that's cast out in that story. And in verse 26, we started. Now, the woman was a Gentile of the Syro-Phoenician race, and she kept asking him to cast a demon out of her daughter. And so here's a woman. She is from both Syrian and Phoenician background, and she has a daughter with a demon, and she continually comes to Jesus. Now watch what Jesus does. It's very interesting. He tests her. Verse 27. And he was saying to her, let the children be satisfied first, for it is not good to take the children's bread and throw them to the dogs. Now Jesus is testing her here by repeating a Jewish proverb. Now, the proverb basically translates to this. Remember, the Jews always called the Gentiles dogs. It literally means this. It's not good to take that which is meant for God's chosen and holy people and give it to immoral and lost, idolatrous and hateful pagans. Now, this is the Jews' philosophy. It's not Jesus' philosophy, but he uses it to test the woman. Does she have the same prejudice towards the Jews that they have towards her? And of course, her answer is that she's willing for a child to take the bread that falls from the master's table. In this, she passes a test because she's saying, I recognize that the Jews are chosen of God, that they've held a special place, and that they're meant to be the instrument of blessing to all of us. And I'm willing to receive the blessings that come from the Jewish race. And so she passes the test, and her daughter is delivered. Now, when you step back for a minute, you realize the reason for all of this is because God promised Abraham that it was through his descendants that all the nations of the world would be blessed. So it was their honor and their responsibility to take the gospel to the world. And so Jesus came to give the gospel to the Jews, who would then have the responsibility of sharing it with the world. And so Jesus largely stayed within this lane of giving it to the Jews, but he did make exceptions when he came across Gentiles in need. All right, God bless you. Get ready for tomorrow, chapter 8.